November 24, 1943. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean as the B-17 Flying Fortress Mi Amigo flew steadily at 20,000 feet. The sky was a brilliant hue of orange and pink, but the crew inside had no time to admire it. The rhythmic hum of the engines, once a comfort, now felt like a ticking clock, a reminder of the danger that hovered just beyond their range of sight. In the distance, the dark silhouettes of enemy fighters emerged, a swarm of Japanese A-6M0s closing in for the kill. Staff Sergeant John L. "Red" Morgan, the tail gunner of the B-17, was perched in his position at the rear of the aircraft. His hands were steady, gripping the twin .50 caliber machine guns, eyes scanning the horizon. The Zeros were known for their agility and deadly accuracy, and Morgan had fought alongside his crew in countless sorties. This was nothing new. But today felt different. There was something in the air, a palpable tension that even the seasoned crew couldn't shake. The attack came without warning. The first wave of Zeros descended like vultures, their engines roaring as they dived toward the Mi Amigo. Red's heart raced, but he remained calm. The B-17 was already taking hits. Bullets thudded against the fuselage, shaking the plane and rattling the crew. But Morgan's focus remained sharp. He was the last line of defense, the rear of the fortress. His job was simple: keep the tail clear and keep the aircraft in the air. "Steady, Red," came the voice of the pilot over the intercom. "We've got incoming." With a twist of his wrist, Red swung his twin .50 cal guns into position. The Zeros were fast, weaving through the air like sharks circling their prey, but Red had the advantage. His guns were designed for exactly this kind of engagement, up close and personal, where a split-second decision could mean life or death. He squeezed the trigger, and the guns roared to life, sending a steady stream of bullets into the night sky. The first Zero broke formation, spinning out of control as Red's aim found its mark. The aircraft spiraled downward, smoke trailing from its wings as it plummeted to the sea below. But there was no time to celebrate. More Zeros were closing in, and the B-17's fate hung in the balance. Red's mind was a blur of movement and calculation. Each attack required precision, each burst of fire a calculated risk. He knew that if he missed even once, the next enemy aircraft could end the mission, end their lives. More Zeros came in fast, diving from above and from the side, firing as they went. Red's eyes never left his target. He tracked the movements of each plane with calculated intensity, knowing that the survival of the entire crew depended on his focus. Another Zero came in low, aiming for the tail. Red's guns blazed again, and the aircraft exploded in a burst of flame and debris. It was a moment of triumph, but the battle was far from over. The aircraft was taking heavy damage, and Red could feel the vibrations through the tail of the plane as the fuselage was punctured by enemy fire. "Red, how are we looking back there?" the pilot called out over the intercom. "Just fine, sir," Red replied, his voice steady but filled with tension. "We're not going down yet." Despite the damage, the B-17 pressed on, fighting to stay in the air as the Zeros continued to swarm. Red's hands were raw from the constant motion, his knuckles white as he fired round after round into the sky. His focus never wavered, his training and instincts taking over. But then a sharp, jarring explosion rattled the tail. The plane shook violently, and for a moment it seemed as if the Mi Amigo might break apart in midair. Red's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't stop. His mission was simple: protect the tail, protect his crew, and ensure that the plane made it back to base. The Mi Amigo continued its descent, rocked by the force of enemy fire. The B-17's tail section, where Red was positioned, was taking the brunt of the assault. The fuselage was riddled with over 300 bullet holes, and Red could feel the vibrations as pieces of the aircraft rattled loose. The rear gunner's compartment was a nightmare. Smoke from the surrounding damage filled the air, making it difficult to see, but Red's training kicked in. Every muscle in his body was wired for this moment. Red was aware that the enemy pilots were no longer just attacking the plane, they were attacking him. The Zeros were no longer making quick, focused strikes. Instead, they came at him in furious waves. This was personal. They were determined to take him out, and with each incoming Zero, the air grew thicker with the realization that the odds were against him. He could see it in the speed and aggression of the attackers. The Japanese pilots knew that if they could destroy the tail gunners, the B-17 would be helpless, a sitting duck for their comrades. The roar of the engines filled Red's ears, but he could still hear the crunching of metal as the Zeros ripped into the aircraft. It was a symphony of destruction, with every burst of enemy gunfire a bitter reminder of how close they were to falling from the sky. The first wave of Zeros was relentless, but Red had learned something in his training. It wasn't about taking out every enemy plane in sight, it was about making every shot count. His hands were steady, his eyes narrowed. He was no longer just a tail gunner, he was a fighter, and this was his battlefield. The Mi Amigo was his responsibility, and he was determined to keep it flying. Another Zero approached from behind, coming in fast. Red didn't hesitate. He fired at the perfect moment, letting the aircraft close in before he squeezed the trigger. The tail gunner's twin .50 cal machine guns erupted in a cloud of fire and noise. The Zero exploded in a flash of flames, its wreckage falling away from the B-17 as it spiraled into the ocean below. But there was no time to savor the victory. The Zeros kept coming. Red's grip tightened as the rear machine guns continued to rattle, his focus never wavering. Each time he hit a Zero, it felt like a small victory, but the battle was far from over. For every one Red took out, two more seemed to appear. One of the Zeros came in so close that Red could hear the shrill whine of its engines just above the roar of his own guns. It was like a thunderclap in the confined space of the tail gunner's compartment. The enemy plane opened fire, and Red saw the tracers fly past him in a deadly dance. He ducked instinctively, but there was no escape. The Mi Amigo shook again, and Red felt a jolt in his chest. He had been hit. Blood trickled from his side where a bullet had grazed him, but Red didn't flinch. He was still alive, and as long as he was, his guns would keep firing. His body screamed in pain, but he was used to the discomfort. Pain was just another part of the fight. The damage to the Mi Amigo was getting worse, but they weren't going down, not yet. Another Zero darted in, and this time Red's aim was true. The aircraft erupted into flames, its wings folding under the sheer force of Red's barrage. The Zero went down in a fiery trail, plummeting toward the sea, but it was only a brief reprieve. The attack was unrelenting. Red's fingers were raw from the continuous pressure of the triggers, and sweat mixed with the blood on his brow. His body ached, his legs numb from the cramped position, but there was no time to worry about his pain. The crew depended on him, and there was no room for weakness. The Zeros were determined to tear the Mi Amigo apart, but they had underestimated the strength of the B-17 crew, especially the man in the tail gunner's seat. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Red fired, reloaded, and fired again. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it up, but he wasn't about to stop. His crew, the men he had flown with, fought beside, were counting on him. They needed to make it back. As another Zero came into view, Red leveled his guns and fired once more. The plane went down, and Red's heart pounded in his chest. For every victory, however, more enemies emerged from the darkness, but Red refused to stop. He knew that the Mi Amigo could survive this. He had to make sure of it. The battle raged on, with the Mi Amigo bearing the brunt of a relentless, coordinated attack. The air around Red was thick with smoke, the pungent scent of burning fuel and metal filling his nostrils. The Mi Amigo was a battered fortress now, its fuselage riddled with over 300 bullet holes, but it wasn't going down, not while Red was still standing, figuratively at least. Despite the damage, the crew inside remained focused. They had taken hits and they had lost men, but they were still fighting, still flying, still refusing to surrender. Red's eyes never wavered from his sights as more Zeros approached, like vultures, sensing the weakening prey below them. The Japanese pilots were well-trained, skilled, and ruthless, but so was Red. His fingers were sore, his grip slipping slightly on the metal of the twin .50 cals. He had been firing non-stop for what seemed like an eternity, but his resolve had not wavered. He could feel the weight of every shot, the thundering recoil as the heavy rounds ripped into the night air, but every time he hit a target, it fueled his determination. He wasn't just defending the tail of a B-17, he was defending his crew, his comrades, and the legacy of their mission. Through the haze of smoke and the stinging cold of the Pacific winds, another Zero came into view. It was coming in fast at a steep angle, trying to dive on the B-17 from above. Red's heart raced, his mind focused entirely on the enemy fighter. His hands were a blur as he leveled his guns and fired. The first shot missed, but he quickly adjusted, his training kicking in. He squeezed the trigger again, and this time his aim was true. The Zero exploded in mid-air, a ball of fire that lit up the night sky like a flash of lightning. The aircraft spiraled downward, its pieces scattering across the sky, but there was no time to rest. More Zeros were coming. Red's eyes darted around, his body tensing with every passing second. The plane was falling apart around him and the heavy metal creaked with every movement. The tail had been struck multiple times and he could feel the vibrations as the plane struggled to stay airborne. Red could hear the crew's voices over the intercom, distorted by the crackle of static. "How's it going back there, Red?" the pilot asked, his voice barely audible through the noise. "We're still in the fight," Red replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "But they're not giving up." He fired again, sending another Zero tumbling from the sky. The enemy was becoming more desperate, their attacks coming faster and more recklessly, but Red had learned how to handle this. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his senses sharpened beyond belief. Every move he made now was instinctual. Every shot, every burst of fire was as natural as breathing. But then, as another Zero dove in, something unexpected happened. The Mi Amigo lurched violently, the force of the impact nearly throwing Red from his seat. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to slow as the tail of the B-17 twisted in mid-air. A devastating hit had torn through the aircraft's rear, and Red felt the deep, shaking tremor of the damage. His heart skipped a beat and his mind raced as he glanced at the tail. A large section of the fuselage was gone, torn apart by the enemy's fire. The damage was severe, yet the B-17 was still flying. The crew was still alive. Red's eyes narrowed as he realized something critical. The Zeros had finally hit the tail, but they hadn't broken it, not yet. "Come on, Mi Amigo," Red muttered under his breath. "Hold together." He adjusted his position, the gunfire continuing in a relentless barrage. The Zeros were circling, waiting for the final moment to strike. Red's eyes scanned the horizon, his fingers still gripping the triggers with an unwavering resolve. There were only a few more Zeros left. He could see them closing in, ready to make their final assault. But Red wasn't going to let them have the satisfaction. One last Zero dove from above, its guns blazing. Red fired, his aim unwavering, and the Zero erupted in a ball of flame. It tumbled downward, crashing into the ocean below. In that moment, the Mi Amigo was still flying. It was bruised, battered, but it wasn't beaten. And neither were they. The enemy fighters had retreated, their numbers depleted, their morale shattered. The battle was over. But the Mi Amigo was far from home, and the journey back was going to be as dangerous as the fight itself. Red's hands were shaking as he stopped firing, the reality of the situation sinking in. He had done it. They had done it. As the Mi Amigo limped back toward base, Red's thoughts were with his crew. They were battered, bloodied, but they had survived. They had made it through the most harrowing attack imaginable, and it was Red's unyielding defense that had kept them alive. The journey back to base was long, and the Mi Amigo seemed to groan with every passing mile. The once proud B-17 now resembled a haggard warhorse, battered and broken, but still moving forward with relentless determination. Red sat in the tail gunner's compartment, his hands still gripping the twin .50 cal machine guns, though the violence of the battle had long since subsided. His eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion, his body aching from the continuous onslaught of fire and recoil, but his mind refused to shut down. It was hard to reconcile the silence with the chaos that had just unfolded. They had survived, but at what cost? The Mi Amigo was leaking fuel from multiple punctures, and the engines sputtered in uneven bursts. The damage was severe, the aircraft bearing the scars of the intense battle. Red could feel the strain on the plane's frame, a tension in the air that hinted at the fragile state of their survival. He could hear the intermittent hum of the radio as the pilot communicated with the ground crew, and though the words were drowned out by the noise of the engines, Red could feel the weight of the moment settling on him. As the aircraft began its slow approach to the airbase, Red's thoughts turned to the crew. They had fought as one. Every man in that plane had earned the right to call themselves a hero. But Red knew that their survival wasn't just a matter of luck. It had been a matter of grit, resolve, and a will to fight when the odds were impossible. The B-17 limped into the airfield, its landing gear scraping against the tarmac with a sound that was as much relief as it was painful. The aircraft touched down, and the impact jarred Red, though he held tight to his position. The plane rolled to a stop, its engines coughing and sputtering, finally coming to a shuddering halt. The silence that followed was overwhelming. There was no fanfare, no immediate cheering or clapping, just the stillness of an aircraft that had defied all odds, a silent testament to the crew's resilience. Red slowly climbed out of his compartment, his legs stiff and unsteady from hours of tension. He looked around at his fellow crew members as they filed out of the plane. Each man was dirty, bloodied, and exhausted, but there was something else in their eyes, something that spoke of the incredible toll they had just endured and the pride they carried in having made it through. Red's gaze met the pilot's, and without a word they shared a look that conveyed everything. They had made it. They had survived the impossible, and against all odds they were still standing. And as Red looked back at the battered aircraft, the legacy of their survival started to sink in. Word of the Mi Amigo's journey spread quickly across the airbase, the crew's heroics becoming the stuff of legend. The stories of how Red had single-handedly shot down multiple Zeros, how he had kept the tail gunner's position intact despite taking fire from all directions, were recounted with awe. The crew had faced death, but they had emerged victorious. In the days that followed, Red was given a hero's welcome. He was lauded by his fellow soldiers, awarded medals for his bravery, and his name spread across every airbase in the Pacific. But Red wasn't interested in the accolades. His thoughts were always with the crew of the Mi Amigo, the men who had fought beside him, the ones who had made it through the battle and the ones who hadn't. As he walked through the base, his uniform covered in dirt and blood, Red couldn't help but think of the lives lost that day, the men who hadn't made it back. Their faces lingered in his mind, and the weight of that loss hung heavy on his heart. But there was something else that kept him going, the bond he had with his crew, the unspoken understanding that they were all in this together. It was that bond that had kept them alive, and it was that bond that would carry them through whatever came next. The Mi Amigo might have been severely damaged, but it wasn't done yet. Just like Red, the aircraft had proven that it could withstand the worst and still keep flying. And for Red, that was what mattered most. They had survived the fight of their lives, and together they had earned their place in history.